Have you ever played a harpsichord? You have a channel on YouTube that focuses largely on 18th century cooking and life. Now, why did you choose the 18th century? What is it about that time period that compels you to do your YouTube channel?
Well, generally, when we're looking at history, we also are looking at judging our future from the history in the past. And the 18th century is a wonderful time frame to look at for our history if we want to see what's happening in the future of our culture, because so many things that were happening in the 18th century are happening to us today. There was a big change from agricultural to an industrial civilization, and we had these clashes of cultures that were happening because of people coming in and settling the continent where there were already people. So things like that and similar things are happening today. So the 18th century is a wonderful time to go back, look at, say, hey, what did they do right? What did they do wrong?
That's an interesting thought because not only did you have a mix of peoples, you had a mix of food.
Yeah.
So you had the great Columbian exchange going on where people were getting used to new foods, like the chili pepper, for example, which was unknown in Europe and Asia before this time, but also things like the tomato, which, as I recall, was still thought to be poisonous in much of Europe at the time. Now, how has food changed since then? What would we recognize from the 18th century and what wouldn't we recognize?
Well, we do have this wonderful not only recognizing or trying to adapt to these new food types, corn, maize, which they, of course, didn't have, and other products, but we also have this blending of culture that's happening in the 18th century where the English are adapting to German dishes and French dishes and vice versa, or even the African influences that come in with the enslaved people. So we've got this wonderful blend of cultures that can happen here that couldn't necessarily happen in other places. So the English aren't adapting, even though they have some of those same people in the area. They're going to stay English, whereas here it's, hey, this is a new place. Let's all, kind of intermix a little bit more with our foods. So that's one of those other things that's happening in the 18th century with food specifically, and here in North America.
You also have things like the Native American influences, like pemmican. As I recall, you made a video series on making that. So, what influences did that have? How important was Native American cooking to the 18th century colonies?
Well, it was tremendously important. I mean, you were mentioning those foods that weren't in Europe at the time and are in North America. And these Europeans that are coming over here, they don't know how to use these foods. I mean, maize specifically or corn is very difficult to deal with if you're trying to pretend that it's wheat. It does not do the same kind of sort of. It doesn't do the same thing. And the Europeans learn how to use these products by learning those from the Native Americans. So that is definitely influencing the foods. Now, the Europeans may not necessarily want to time period claim those things that they're getting from the Native Americans, but it's certainly happening.
So with Europe, they're adapting and adjusting, but adopting these foods slowly. As I recall, like something like a tomato or corn would have been known in Europe to some as early as the 1500s, but they may not have actually started using it until the 1800s, correct?
Definitely in the case of something like tomatoes. Corn had to be introduced and used almost immediately for survival reasons. They could not get wheat and barley and different grains like that to grow nearly as well as they could get corn to grow. So corn was adapted almost immediately. Had to be. I mean, they're the folks that are at Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they're starving the first year unless they're eating that corn. So they're adapting to that immediately. These other items, specifically something like tomatoes, those get introduced and used immediately and used as food in Italy or in France and Spain. It certainly takes the English a lot longer to decide that that's terribly edible. And there may be different reasons why people thought they weren't edible. And they are part of that nightshade group. So there's definitely some, hey, maybe this isn't the best kind of food in the world.
How did that affect like colonial America? Were we eating tomatoes earlier than Britain was?
Yes and no. I mean, North America is a very complex place in the 18th century. A lot of different people groups and different regions. Some of those places are going to adopt that, especially if they've already been introduced to that. So if there's a Spanish cultural influence in a particular area or French, you might see those things being used in other places. Definitely not. So it's actually a kind of a complex environment to say, and generalize and say that it wasn't being used in North America, when obviously in certain places those things are adopted pretty quickly.
The influence is certainly very cultural at that time, probably due to lack of communication. But today, in today's society, we have a much more interconnected culture, so we can share foods much faster, leading to this sort of culture of trying new foods that we see.
Yeah.
Did anything like that? I mean, how did people react as they were trying these new foods? I mean, do you see in the old cookbooks from that period where people are saying, "Well, we have a new ingredient," or do you see any kind of innovation?
The more interesting thing would be getting into the journals as people travel from one place to another, and they talk about the foods as they get to another place. So Dr. Alexander Hamilton, that's traveling his journal from the 1740s, not the Alexander Hamilton we're thinking later on in the 18th century, but an earlier one. He has this wonderful diary, and he travels out of Maryland and goes into these northern colonies, and really they treat him almost like a complete foreigner. He gets asked very strange and pertinent questions, and he talks about the food as he goes along, and you can see he's being introduced to different foods as he goes north into different areas, and there are other places where somebody might say, well, I couldn't eat any of the food that was offered to us because it had so much garlic, that I couldn't stand it. And garlic was another one of those things that in England, at the time period, it was more of a medicinal thing, whereas in other parts of Europe, that was a standard food.
So even garlic, which is an old world food, was seen with suspicion.
Right.
How does this go backwards? In other words, you had French colonies in what's now the United States. Were they sort of giving pushback and saying the same sorts of things at the time, or is that not recorded?
more than likely, I just don't have access to the French journals that are going on. And different kinds of societies are more interested in, writing in journals. Sometimes they're very useful. Other times you're only getting a very, high level slice of society, because people who write journals are only going to be, high society kind of people. But I haven't read too much in that, but you definitely see this kind of grading, even in foods, between all these different cultures that are having to, rub elbows in North America.
And on that, we have to go to break. We'll be back in a moment with Jon Townsend.
If you'd like to support Event Horizon, you'll be pleased to know we've recently launched a Patreon. Link in the description below. Or alternatively, you can use your cellular telephone to scan the assemblage of squares on screen now. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share the video. And now, back to Jon.
And we're back with Jon Townsend. Jon, now, I wanted to ask you about foods that, from that period, that we would still recognize. I noticed that on your channel, you do a lot of foods that we don't recognize anymore, dishes from Hannah Glass's cookbooks and things like that. But there are certain things that we would know, such as mac and cheese. What do we still eat in a similar way to the 18th century, or is it just so radically different that if you transplanted someone from 1780 to today, they would just be they would be like, I have nothing to eat, with this culture? How has culinary tastes changed since then?
I would say that they wouldn't be, well, I don't know. Different regions of the United States today are going to eat differently. I don't think anybody from 1780 is going to be that weirded out by coming and eating at my house for a week or so. Different places might be different. I am sure that at certain times, it can be difficult to answer that, because I'm not a person from 1780, but I think that they would recognize a lot of what we eat today. And that's the fun part of the channel, is both going to look at the foods that are almost exactly the same, and then foods that are almost completely different, or things that we don't recognize at all, or don't recognize it in the form that we would eat it today. Although there are timeline connections to that food as we go back into history. The idea of puddings, or we did the episode on fried chicken, which made a wonderful fried chicken that almost anybody would completely recognize, and it was from 1720s, so some of their foods are almost exactly the same, and that's a great episode to do. And then the other ones that are weird foods.
It's interesting, because if you're going to cook fried chicken, obviously the dependency on eggs that we still have today was ever present back then too, that you used them for almost everything.
Yeah.
Now, what I wonder about is, in organic gardening and heirloom gardening, you run across these strains that are thought to be very old, but they're usually not. They're 19th century. So a lot of the vegetables back then would have been a little bit different than what we have today, in that they were different strains that have gone extinct. So even a tomato at that time might not have looked so much like, you would have recognized it as a tomato, but it might have been a different color, such as purple or something like that. Now, in reenactment, do you try to seek out, when you do these videos, do you try to seek out old strains of vegetables if you can get them? And are there ingredients that you just can't find?
A perfect example to that would be something like skirrets, this item that you'll see in paintings and you'll see referenced in cookbooks, but you can't find them commercially grown. I think occasionally you can find a seed catalog that has skirrets, and they're a white carrot-looking product, maybe a little skinnier, and I think they're closely related to parsnips. So when we can, we like to use items that are more closely related to period objects or period food products. But that is not possible very often. And the strains certainly must have been quite different at times in the 18th century than the items that we have today. The foods, the fruits and vegetables we have today have been so hybridized and produced to fit our food production and consumption. So we want items that can ripen very quickly and that we can put in a box and they won't get messed up as they're riding in a truck for 500 miles. And then they can sit on the shelf for 10 days. I think that there are pluses and minuses. I mean, some of these enhancements that have happened in modern times have helped in flavor, have helped in texture, and then other ones, we're missing out on these wonderful flavors that their items had because they didn't need to travel long distances or have some special characteristic that we need to have them today. I was looking at a recipe just earlier today, and they were talking about producing carrots, cooking carrots, and their boiling time was just huge. And so the carrots that recipe was referencing must have been just tough as wood to get them to have them be able to boil as long as this recipe had.
Yeah, well, with carrots particularly, if you let them go too long, they get woody.
Yeah.
And, so it might even have been that they just had too long of a growing time. And
well, the recipe actually referred to small young carrots, and then this other carrot called a sandwich carrot, which must have been the use a chainsaw to cut it up kind of a carrot. So
you also wonder too is there such a thing as a late season carrot that you can grow into the months getting closer to winter that can be
right,
pulled out of the ground in October or something like that and used out of necessity. So necessity probably plays a part in those recipes, doesn't it?
Definitely. You'll definitely see that sort of thing going on. And as you go in the recipe book, you can see how seasons are definitely changing, what kinds of things are available, because they had much more seasonality to their foods than we do today.
And they also had storage concerns because you have to store it through winter in a root cellar or even just, as I recall, they would bury it sometimes, wouldn't they? They would just bury potatoes and things like that in the ground to try to keep them below the frost line, and so that they would have something, in the middle of winter.
And some things are actually better if they're frosted. Something like a Brussels sprout, you can grow in the late fall, and you can pick them all, much into December and even January, and they actually get better that way. So yeah, they had all these very, very difficult things to deal with food preservation and whether they, bury things in straw or just cover up the plants. But they had to deal with all those things, and they learned these wonderful ways to preserve.
What would the life of a farmer in the 18th century have looked like? When would they get up and start working in, say, peak season when it's time to harvest?
They are getting up before the sun comes up. They are going out in the field working right away. Some of them a lot of times you'll see references to people, working several hours and then coming in and having breakfast, going back out into the field, working. And when it's peak season, it is working continuously. And then other parts of the year when it's easier, you don't have a continuous working all day. You have other jobs to do. So they're working all the time. But many people talk about it being a very good life. So what we might think of as just sheer drudgery, they were used to that. They weren't bored by that, and they had lots of fun things to do.
Well, they had a lot less distraction too. They didn't have cell phones and all of this. So, to them, entertainment would be sitting around and enjoying the family or reading a really big book, especially in the 19th century where people were writing huge volume books. Now, what would the farmer have had for breakfast? Now, I know you did a video on that too, and I was struck by how familiar the breakfast actually looked. There was toast and eggs and bacon, as I recall. So what would they have had for breakfast?
Well, breakfasts can be very, very cultural in that time period and very even regional. And while some people might have a typical breakfast like we might think of, bacon and eggs and, toast. Other people are just going to have something like a cup of chocolate for breakfast, or something very, very simple, just tea, or even just dry bread. So there's so many differences between regions and in economic status that it's almost difficult to think about. I mean, you really have to kind of pinpoint it into these different people, and that's why journals and different items like that can be very nice, because they point to these, what it's like for that kind of specific person. Sometimes they reference these different foods in a journal because they're so strange or so different. So we get some real fun pictures of what food is like by those sorts of things. So breakfast could be just about anything, just like it could be for you or me. Very different.
Let's talk about seasoning, because that was another one that was, certain things in that time period would have been almost unheard of as far as seasoning. As I recall, the Dutch had an expression, and that's still there, pepper expensive, because black pepper was really expensive up until a certain point in time. So how does seasoning the food differ? What are there herbs and things that they used that we wouldn't think to use today? And how was that dealt with? Was the food more bland when you work with these recipes, and you can actually buy these reprints of these cookbooks on your website, link in the description below, that how is it different? Is it more bland? Is there things that are used that we no longer use to spice up the food?
At least in the English cookery books in the time period, the number of spices are very contracted compared to what we use today. They're almost always the same thing over and over again. You're going to see salt and pepper. There you will also see things like lemon and lemon zest in there for flavorings. The biggie that shows up all the time that we don't use the same way at all is, of course, nutmeg. That's what the channel's almost all about. Nutmeg. Nutmeg is in everything. They're using it all the time. And the why is, I'm not sure if I know the exact reason why. I think part of it is because nutmeg was expensive, and you're showing off by using something like nutmeg. Nutmeg is, it's more subtle. It's more earthy. And I'm not sure why it was so totally used in everything, whether it's sweet or savory, whatever. It had mace in it, it had nutmeg. So we see those all the time. We do see things like cayenne pepper popping up. We definitely don't have this mass number of strange, spices that we might use today. They sometimes will show up in herb bundles. They'll just say, toss in sweet herbs, toss in savory herbs. So we'll see those in many recipes. But the big strange thing that pops out is nutmeg. I don't know why it is.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that nutmeg is used a lot on your channel with the recipes. Also, but see, you don't really see things like mace anymore used, and it's sort of fallen out of use. And nutmeg is essentially, I guess, a holiday herb at this point. You might put it in certain things, but you don't see it too often. Now, you mentioned a cup of chocolate as a breakfast. How prevalent was chocolate at the time?
Chocolate was very, very prevalent as a breakfast drink in that whole 18th century time period. And you will see references to, you might have a coffee house someplace and they might serve tea, there's coffee, but right up there with them is chocolate as a drink. Almost exactly the same sort of popularity as those items. And you'll see it quite often referenced as a breakfast drink. Not as probably heavily milked as we might think. It's not, a hot chocolate drink that we might have today that was highly sweetened and had a lot of milk in it, but was just plain chocolate drink with hot water. And for many people, that was breakfast. It might just be tea. It might just be chocolate. But chocolate was very popular.
I suppose you still see the division in preparations of chocolate because we still call it Swiss or Dutch to this day, even though it's not anything close to what it would have been 300 years ago.
Right.
It could be said that existence is a phenomenon of change. Some people resist change, some people embrace it, and there will come a time where our existence as we live it now, with our phones, internet, YouTube, and social media, all goes to the wayside, ushering in something new. At some point, we will all simply be historical figures, left to the mists of time like our own ancestors are to us. Or will we? We may just as easily live in a period of profound change, unlike anything the human species has ever experienced before. What do concepts such as radical life extension and anti-aging therapy do to future historical timelines? Do the winds of change still blow, or do we become a compartmentalized culture where some live in the past with their cell phones while still others use the latest in technology, such as neural implants? So you tell me, do you think we are in the midst of a profound shift in what it means to exist as a human? Will we take historical reenactment to virtual reality and make the past live again in ways we can only imagine now? Or will we just trudge on as humans always have and tone these technologies down and ourselves someday become another chapter in history? Would you live in the past, at least for a short period of time? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I would have loved to have lived in the 18th century. Simpler times.
After careful analysis, I'm certain you would have not survived.
What gives you that idea, Anna?
Careful analysis.
Can you give me an example?
It took you 32 attempts to light the pilot lamp on the central heating yesterday.
I'd have been fine, Anna.
And also cold.
Yeah, and on that note, next week I'll be joined by Dr. Duncan Lorimer, co-discoverer of fast radio bursts. In fact, the first identified one is often called the Lorimer burst. See you then.